All right. It has been a few weeks, but here I am back. And today is a super special Unapologetic Disruptive for Good podcast because we have some international flavor coming on here of an incredible pioneer in the work that we all discuss. Not to mention, she is coming with her Unapologetic Disrupting partner in greatness. Both friends of mine, and I am super excited. We have been talking about putting on this podcast for a while. So the fact that I get to talk to two friends and let others just kind of jump in to our conversations is exciting to me, because we have shared conversations literally across the globe from where I sit right now, in both encouragement and masterminding of what we can do to continue this work on an international scale, while also supporting each other. And I will tell you, these two incredible guests are near and dear to my heart, not just because of the incredible work that has happened across the globe based off of what they've contributed, but the friendships and just saying, how are you? Or the text messages or the emails or the conversations when we get to see each other. So I am really excited about tonight's podcast, and I am sorry if you hear a sniffle or two. I am struggling from this southern spring pollen allergy thing, so I apologize if that gets in the way. I'm going to try to mute as much as I can. But nonetheless, I cannot wait for you all to hear from tonight's guest. Margaret Thorsborne has been awarded an Order of Australia Medal for her service to education, both locally and internationally. She consults to public and private sector businesses and organizations to enhance workplace relationships and the management of high-level conflict and inappropriate behavior. She's committed to improving the way people relate to each other in schools, workplaces, and other community groups by providing processes that allow deeply negative feelings to be gradually transformed into cooperation. She does this work internationally, and I am so excited for you to hear. But she also has her partner in awesomeness, Mr. Joe Brummer, who has been on this podcast several times at this point, but not with his partner in greatness. But Joe has been dedicated to the field of trauma-informed restorative practices and justice since 2008, during which time he has facilitated hundreds of circles, mediations, and community conferences. Over the past 17 years, he has trained thousands of individuals in these transformative practices, including educators, parents, workplace professionals, diversion staff, and volunteers and community members. Together, they both have written two amazing books. One is Building a Trauma-Informed Restorative School, Skills and Approaches to Improve Culture and Behavior, and also Becoming a Trauma-Informed Restorative Educator, Practical Skills to Change Culture and Behavior, both from Kingsley Publishers. So welcome both Marg and Joe. I am so excited to have you all part of this conversation. Just tell us a little bit more about yourselves and how this work all comes about. Why'd you choose to jump in and write multiple books? Not that that's easy.
Well, Matt, when I started out in this restorative relational space 30 years ago, there were no resources. There was nothing. So it was just really a slow process of, first of all, it started out as a training manual. And I guess, Joe, when it's your turn to have a little chat, you could talk about your manuscript occupying that space as well. But over the years, it became clear that the train and hope model was hopeless. So a colleague and I, who understood a bit more about culture change, wrote a book in 2013 about implementation of these approaches in schools. And then, I just met someone else who was an ex-school principal of a special school who'd migrated to Australia, and he was at the same workshop that I was at, and we thought, why don't we do a workshop together? And the next thing we know, we thought, why don't we transform that workshop into a book? So then there was the restorative practice and special needs, and then someone else said, well, we need to write about the psychological theory underpinning this approach, and so the next book popped up. So it's just it sounds like as if I've been really, really productive, but actually it's been about the collaboration. I have just loved it, and which is why, it has been so exciting for me to collaborate with Joe, who's been, I think, a national treasure, really. So there you
Joe,
go.
a national treasure. What are your thoughts about that? When Marg, who is a Australian national treasure herself, coined you as the U.S. national treasure.
And that's usually an exaggeration, but I still take the flattery from Marg. I think again, when a 30-year veteran and pioneer of the work wants to write a book with you, you don't say no. You just do that. And so this has been a really nice journey. And Marg and I sort of online virtually knew of each other, I think on LinkedIn or one of the many social media sites. I don't really remember which one. And then we met in person in Minnesota. Was it Minnesota? Yes,
Yeah,
it was Minnesota.
it was 2018.
We have a mutual friend, Lee Rush, who both of us knew, even though we kind of knew of each other. But Lee gave us a formal introduction, and then I was talking about, I don't know, we were talking about books and publishing somehow, and then Marg said, "Well, my publisher's here," and I was like, "Well, how about you introduce me?" And so I talked to the guy and I said, I have a manuscript I'd love for you to look at, which was actually this training manual I'd written that, looking back on it, it was absolute garbage. And, it had some charm to it, but it was really bad. And, with some careful editing, it actually got turned into a pretty good book. And a lot of additions from Marg around international perspective and really better history of the work. I mean, it's one thing to write about the restorative questions. It's a second thing to tell the history of them. And I think Marg brought a lot of that to the first book. And then, our publisher sort of hounded us for a little while to write another book. And that was a challenge. I'll let Marg explain this story, but it was quite a challenge to write this. Like to even get ourselves going was really difficult.
Yeah, we really suffered from writer's block, didn't we? We had all these ideas running around in our heads, but kind of even putting some cohesive plan together was a bit of a challenge. And then always the worry about, so whose theory, gets the gong in which chapter, and that in itself was interesting because there were things, that I learnt from Joe, and there are things Joe had not ever, talked about much or studied much, which I was able to contribute. So finally, we kind of got over the inertia of too high anxiety, and then got cracking. But then we had to keep asking for extensions. So I think in the end it was about 9 months over our contract to have delivered. But we're glad we've sort of had that birthing experience, because I think it's been one of my best contributions to the field. And I'm just very grateful to Joe for his, shared experience and wisdom as well. It's been a delight, really, in general.
That speaks volumes. You've been doing this work for a long time. And I must say, as someone who has sat in the room as a participant, when you all gave the keynote at the Trauma Aware Conference in Brisbane, and also your sessions, you can tell that you all have spent intimate time, not physically together because you've been across the world from each other, but emotionally together, because I walked away in both of those experiences feeling like a better human, like with more equipped to tackle things that I was trying to manage as being back in the principalship, while also pushing my learning. And I think that's what I really want to talk with the audience about, is that pushing of learning that you all are continually doing in the research that you've cited, the content that you're producing in these books, is really pushing this idea of don't just believe everything that you have always been told. There's, like what Joe said, there's history behind the questions of restorative practices. There's more to it. So let's get into that. Let's talk a little bit about what Joe just talked about, some of the history of restorative practices, Marg, that you've experienced, and Joe, and even in you've been doing this work in a significant amount of time. Tell a little bit of the background of this, because I think especially now, and speaking only from an American U.S. climate, there's a lot of not only pushback, but stifling of this work around the political climate. So just tell us a little bit about the history of it.
Well, if we go back to my beginnings, my background's a biology teacher, so none of the stuff that we've explored over time has been an issue for my brain, because as far as I'm concerned, we're all warm-blooded, hairy mammals, and we've evolved to live in community. So in my time as a biology teacher, there was a stage at which I lost the passion for the cross-section of a monocotyledon. So I moved sideways with some postgrad study into school counselling. And it was during that patch that we were always, every school I've ever worked in, having to deal with bullying. So one of the things from the research that we did around what works with bullies is not about how to punish them, because if you punish kids who are mean to each other, then all you do is invite the wrath of God upon the heads of the kids they've been mean to. So it was like manna from heaven when we discovered that in Australia, in a rural city of Wagga Wagga, that's Aboriginal term for crow, and when you hear the word twice, it means many crows. So if you go to Wagga Wagga in the state of New South Wales, it is a damn noisy city. Oh my God, the crow noise is phenomenal. Anyway, the police in Wagga Wagga were using a process that they had adapted from New Zealand about bringing families into the youth justice space to help kids stay out of the court system. And so my colleague Mary Heinemann and I looked at this process and said, oh my God, this is exactly what we need. So it really started because the school I worked at was a very interesting place with all sorts of interesting things happening. And there was a huge assault one night, huge assault, one evening at a school event. And so it presented the opportunity to try out something that I'd read about. And I rang the police that morning in New South Wales and said, I want to do one of these things at midday. How do I do it? So at least I'd invited the right people, because there were 3 boys involved in beating up another boy. So there were 4 families in the room, the school principal and the deputy principal that had handled it. So in all of that, it became clear that the scripted questions, or, we talk in training about a kind of script, had been developed by the police in New South Wales. And so when the event was over, I got a phone call from the police officer who's kind of well known in America. He was then Senior Sergeant Terry O'Connell, but he's now retired. I said to him, well, this stuff makes sense to use in schools. And have you ever thought of training teachers? And he hadn't. So I said, well, would you? And the rest is history. But we started at the pointy end, which is the sorts of things that get kids suspended or excluded. But over all these years, that whole agenda has infused itself into much smaller incidents. I mean, they're not small for the people who are in them, but they're not life-changing, to the point where You know, how does a teacher or a teacher aide or any adult, whether they're a parent or a teacher, actually have a chat with a kid that's reflective, that holds them accountable, invites them to take responsibility? How do you do that one-on-one? And I think it was really about that chat, Joe, that you and I hooked up with you on LinkedIn, because you really appreciated a different thinking using your nonviolent background, I think, with Marshall Rosenberg. So that's where it all started, really. And in lots of respects, I think we're still building the plane while we're flying it, because this new, it's not new, but the neuroscience, the relational neurobiology has really enhanced our why we need to do things differently. I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, and it really is. And in part of the most recent book that you all wrote together in 2024, Joe, you really dug into that connection of not just the neuroscience, but also digging into systems, digging into practices that have been used for a long time, but people don't really understand where they came from or where they stem from or where the history of it is. And you really took time in that book to dig deep into, why do we do these things in schools, or why are these therapies being used? And so talk to us a little bit about just kind of, Marg just kind of set us up from the history, but where we are right now, and especially from a perspective of you working with schools and trying to deconstruct a lot of these misinformed practices that have embedded into our schools.
Yeah, it actually, I mean, you think about how we broke the writer's block, that Marg and I were suffering from trying to write this book. And the very first chapter that got written, like the first paragraphs that got thrown out there, were Marg actually wrote a chapter on just definitions and systems and things like behaviorism and PB4L, PBIS, responsive classroom, all of these sort of, compliance-based behavioristic approaches. And that got me so excited, because I despise behaviorism. It doesn't even make sense to me that, this theory that says human beings, every behavior is a choice. Well, that's not supported by the neuroscience in any way, shape, or form. I think the idea that we only do things to avoid pain and seek pleasure, also not. I think some of us make very conscious choices to suffer out some pain because we get a good outcome. And so I think these very simplistic ideas of behaviorism really should have gotten questioned right from the start, when Pavlov and Skinner and Watson did all of their experiments on pigeons and rats, and then applied that thinking to very complex humans. Right there, we should have been like, yeah, something's funky here. But I also was really diving. I mean, I dove into Alfie Kohn's book, Punished by Rewards, back in I don't know, when, 2010 or something, 2008, somewhere way back when. I read Punished by Rewards, and then I read Unconditional Parenting, and I was like, there's this notion out there that these things don't work. There's no science behind them. PBIS has very little science behind it. Applied behavioral analysis has even less. Most of the science on that stuff is based on case studies. There's no long-term scales on ABA. There's one big study on ABA that was done by our own United States Department of Defense. And it came back and said that ABA was completely ineffective at changing behavior in autistic kids in military schools. And so we have the biggest study ever done on ABA shows that it's harmful. Here we are, especially in the United States. There are states in the United States where ABA is mandatory. yet it greatly harms children. It ups their, for autistic kids, it ups their rates of PTSD, it ups the rates of seclusion and restraint, all of these compliance-based models. And then here I am, at the same time I'm writing this book, I'm also attending this 10-month certification program with Dr. Bruce Perry, who I know has been on this podcast several times. And so I'm spending hours listening to recordings of Dr. Perry giving us, all the aspects of the impacts of trauma. How does the brain develop? How does the brain work? What are we affected by? How does it impact our sensory? And here I'm writing this book and looking at behaviorism and going, these things don't line up. This stuff doesn't make sense together. Why are schools, why are our institutions so carrot and stick models? And so part of what we set out to do in this book was say, look, the science doesn't support this stuff, like, at all. Yet you go to any American school, any English school, any Australian school, New Zealand schools, Ireland, most of the Western world is using these tactics in schools and in workplaces, all based on this, carrot and stick model. But look at if you go back through just the US history of No Child Left Behind, Safe Schools Act, about the same time PBIS got put in place, is also where the motivation of kids starts crumbling. It also coincides with phones and technology, but it also coincides very much with how much we started giving out behavior bucks and rewards and rewarding kids for expected behavior, rather than letting them internally experience the warm fuzzies of doing the right thing. We started giving them external things. So we have just annihilated intrinsic motivation by getting kids to rely on extrinsic motivations. And literally, it's destructive. And then look at the behavior of our kids in schools today. You add technology and mental health issues and anxiety issues. How much of that's just been caused by the fact we set up the wrong environment for them?
So much truth in that. And let me tell you, I'm about to make a video that I'm going to put on social media about the impacts of phones. I'm not going to lie, because it is a combination of multiple things. And Joe, I agree with you. Like, things have changed, but I also want to say the adults have changed, right? So
Yes.
our adults that support our students outside of school and inside of our school we've changed, right? And I think we're trying to put round pegs in square holes. We're trying to get every kid to fit into this model of behavior, and the kids don't come with that anymore, right? And I always say, especially in the US, kids don't come to schools respecting adults. And I don't think it's a bad thing, right? Because there are parts that's just respect them because they're adults, when adults have guided kids to do really poor things that are harmful, where now kids come and question things and adults don't know what to do when a kid has voice. And I think having voice is exactly what we're trying to incorporate when we're talking about these restorative processes. When you're talking about becoming a restorative educator, part of that is, how do kids effectively use their voice in a way where they can advocate for themselves and others, right? In a community that feels supported. Because if a kid isn't in a community that feels supported, we know there's all kinds of ancient proverbs that tell us what happened to children who do not feel connected to a community, right? But so it all comes down to this idea that the community is where this all works. And that's every adult surrounding the student or the child within the school, even bringing the community outside of the school, within the school. I believe all of these parts are integral to ensure students can see their own potential and meet it. So talk about that application process when you're talking about becoming a restorative educator, because the first thing people want to think of, well, I know the 5 questions, right? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? We know all of those, but it's not that. That's not it. So talk deeply about, it's not the questions, right?
It isn't the questions. It's the whole philosophy that underpins the questions that people don't understand or haven't been given the opportunity to understand. So David Karp, who's, an important academic based out of San Diego University and has made a huge contribution to the business of restorative on university campuses. But he talks about the 4 underlying principles. One is inclusive decision-making. Now, how I translate that when I'm working with educators is that if you're in the problem, you get to be in the problem solving, which gives people agency to tell their story and participate in how we're going to fix it, and all the other business of taking responsibility and being accountable. His second point is really about active accountability. That is in the room with the people who are in the problem, so that not are you just accountable to the person you've done it to, but everyone else in this community that has been impacted by it. And also, I mean, there's so many people who've influenced my thinking, but often, and Joe, you touched on it a minute ago when you were talking about how systems fail people. Well, I don't know that you actually said those words, but you intimated that. But, it's not who's failed. Sometimes it's what's failed. What's gone wrong that makes it possible? So the accountability issue is really important, that we're able to have good, open conversations about, the failure of communication about something or other, or, poor systems that are creating, mayhem amongst kids and so on. But then, the essence of it is about repairing the harm, and no one's going to argue about the need for that when we're biologically connected to each other. But the other bit that we don't talk about enough, I don't think, is the need to, repair the ruptures so that we can get back to trusting each other. So it's the only time we're going to feel safe is when we can trust each other. So the business about student voice is, like when I was a child, which was now back when the earth was cooling, children should be seen and not heard. And the impact that had on me as a human being was that I did not find my connection between what I was thinking and my voice until I was in my late 20s, early 30s, because I'd always been shut up. I wasn't allowed to be angry. I wasn't allowed to be frightened. I wasn't allowed to be anything except please my parents and please my teachers.
Mm-hmm.
I was a good kid. I'm not an axe murderer. Well, not yet, anyway.
Still time.
Yeah, there is still time. But I love it that kids have their own ideas about things. And sometimes, we say out of the mouths of babes, kids are very wise given the opportunity. So I'll hand that one over to you, Joe, now, if you like. I forget the question.
I think it's also when we talk about those systems, and I think this is, I heard this when we were in Australia. I in Brisbane, I've heard this all over the US. I've heard this from schools from Canada. The way that restorative practices and trauma-informed have been sold to schools is this packaging of will help you deal with your behavior problems by giving you some sort of alternative discipline thing. And right off the top, that's not this work. That's not how this works. The way that restorative practices and trauma-informed work reduce your suspensions is not by having an alternative. It's by creating an environment that doesn't require them.
Yes.
Right. And so unfortunately, and this is a battle for all of us doing the work, is that we get into schools and we see a lot of circles happening when something goes wrong. But the proactive community building, the academic circles, the respect agreements, the restorative chats, the relationship building, that stuff's not happening. And then people get this bad taste of their mouth about what this work is about, say it doesn't work, write it off, when most of the critics of this work who I do follow. I want to know what they're saying. But most of the people who I find criticizing restorative practices or saying this doesn't work don't have any clue what this is and have never actually studied the work. If this was somebody, that really studied restorative practices and trauma-informed work and then tried it in their school wholeheartedly, and then it doesn't do anything for their school, I would listen to that criticism. But for the rest of these people, I'm not listening to anything they have to say because they don't even know what they're talking about. There's still people that think that you use circle primarily to and the restorative questions only when something went wrong. But they never built the container that allows those deep, rich conversations. And so when Marg talks about, rupture and repair, like we need the repair, you have to have something to repair. Like in order for there to be a relationship repair, there had to be a relationship. And unfortunately, many of the schools that are trying to do this work are just not, they're really not doing restorative practices. They're doing some sort of weird alternative discipline thing when the kids are bad. And that's not what this work is supposed to be about. So for many of those folks, it just doesn't, of course it doesn't work for them. Why would that? That won't work for anybody. And so,
if I can just pop in there before this little thought disappears out of my head, a lot of schools have adopted restorative or trauma-informed because they're looking for better ways or quicker ways for compliance, and that's not the philosophy of this approach.
That won't work.
Even in Australia and New Zealand, who've been very quick to jump on the PBIS bandwagon, but call it something different, positive behaviour for learning, the emphasis is on the child. So I'll say, look, there's nothing you can change. You can change the name of your program with one word and it will change the way you think. So positive climate for learning, or positive culture for learning, or positive relationships for learning immediately puts us back in what do we need to do to make it a school that is one of belonging, where kids' names are spoken to them during the course of the day, because particularly in a high school there will be a number of kids who are not greeted or spoken to without their name there. That's shocking. That is not relational work. It's
and
compliance.
they put all the weight of behavior change comes on children. Let me make this very clear to you. We, the adults, make the rules and the expectations. We, the adults, create the environments and the atmosphere. We, the adults, are in charge of making sure they get food and sleep. But if anything goes wrong, who do we want to hold accountable?
The kid.
If you can't see how messed up that is, please get away from children, because you don't belong around them. You can't be the one that sets up the game and then get angry at the kid when they can't play that game. They didn't create the rule. The kids don't create the rules. The kids didn't create the expectations. The kids didn't create the classroom, the environment. They didn't pick their teachers. Yet who's going to get the weight of punishment and accountability when something goes wrong?
Well, and Joe, to
problematic.
kind of build off that too, is you also have adults in front of kids that don't have shared lived experiences. They don't have things in common with kids. So they're operating in a system, in a paradigm that's based off their own lived experience, or a system that worked well for them without taking into account that, right? It's almost like showing up to a card game and then the kid brings the dice and you're like, what are you doing? Right? It really is that deep. And I think going back to Marg, what you said early on, it's about trust. And having jumped back into a school this year as a principal, I have realized how hard true, authentic, genuine trust is to build with staff when that hasn't been the culture within the school in which I stepped in. It is so complicated to say, listen, I really do want I'm seeing this for you. Let's work together to figure out the problem, when they'd never been asked before to figure out the problem, or that wasn't genuine trust. And then that translates straight to the kids, right? Because the adults don't have trusting relationships and have each other's back and know that I've got your best interest, you've got my best interest, and if we make a mistake, we're going to repair it. That expecting the kids to do that without that model in front of them is almost and nearly impossible, right? But what I see is adults wanting the kids held accountable while also asking for grace. It is very interesting to me. And I just literally said, grace is better received than given in a lot of places when we have school. And that was with an adult that I had a conversation with, because a child made a mistake and they wanted to take something from them that I'm like, no, we're not taking that, because that doesn't connect at all. And you don't have a relationship with the kid. So taking something from a student you don't have a relationship with, it doesn't mean anything. It just reiterates, I can't trust you, right? I can't trust you. You already don't believe in me. You're going to take this thing that I'm excited about away from me. That's not going to work, right? So talk about that idea of trust a little bit deeper, both you, Joe and Marg, around the importance of building that in a culture of a school, with the adults, with the kids, with the community, with the parents, everybody.
Look, there's something we chatted about, Matt, before this podcast started, was picking up on some language from a new connection of mine, Roger Mitchell, in a school in London, who describes his school as emotionally available. He describes the adults in the school as emotionally available. The school has just completed an inspection by the Education Department in England, and that's called the Office of, I don't know, it's called Ofsted. Anyway, anyone from the UK is watching will know what I'm talking about. And a part of the feedback they got was how they talked to kids, asked kids questions about the culture in the school. And one question they always ask is, who do you go to that you can trust? And the kids said, we can go to anyone here because we trust them. Which means in an emotionally available school where the adults are professionally mature, and I'm using Roger Mitchell's words again here, professionally mature and professionally generous, then our brains are wired to check all the time whether we're safe or under threat. And Joe, this is, the brain stuff is our best friend with this, because trust only comes after experiences with adults where kids haven't felt danger, that they felt safe. Anyway, I'll shut up, Joe. You go.
I'll hop off the same story, right? So I'm going to give a shout out to a friend of mine who's the principal of Lincoln Elementary School in New Britain, Connecticut. I've worked with this principal when she was in a couple of schools before this, and she went through my training. I have a 6-day intensive training that she took twice. I don't know how anybody could put up with me for that long, but she took this training, and that was her one takeaway about making sure every student in her school had a trusted adult, and that trusted adult can't be her. If she asks the kid in the school, who's your adult, and they say you, and she's like, it's not me, I see you every blue moon, who's your trusted adult? She wants to make sure that every child in that school, and so her school climate reports on respect, her she showed me her numbers for suspensions are really low, her all of her numbers are amazing. And when she took that school over, that wasn't the case. And so when she implemented these practices over time, and that's what they brought her for, they brought her to bring in trauma-informed restorative practices. And exactly that, she made sure every kid had a trusted adult. And so that's how much trust is important. But here's the catch of that. We go into schools and we say, I need you to do a respect agreement in each classroom. And respect agreements are different than your classroom norms or classroom contracts because they're based on narrative and story, not on just, how do you show respect? Because kids are people pleasers, and they're not going to give you meaningful answers in a respect agreement or a classroom contract. They're going to give you the quote unquote right answers, right? So they're going to say, how do you all want to respect each other? They know exactly what that teacher wants to hear, and that's what they're going to say. But it doesn't mean anything to them. And so bypass that people pleasing, we get them to do a respect agreement, student to student, student to teacher, teacher to student, on what are your stories about respect? And we actually get them to create these relationships based on respect, and respect builds trust. And here's the catch, the rub. If you're going to do these respect agreements with the students, then you got to do it with the staff. What does respect and trust look like? Staff member to staff member. What's it look like staff member to administration, administration to staff? What does it look like when we're all supporting each other? And it was interesting. I went into a school a number of years ago. This is way back when. It's got to be like 15 years ago. I was in this school and I created a respect agreement with the staff. And like 6 months later, I don't even think it was 6 months. I was like 3 months. The principal calls me and said, the staff wants you to come back and do a respect agreement with them. And I was like scratching my head. I'm like, we just did this. Like, what are we talking about? And so I go back and I find out that teachers have been going into each other's classrooms and screaming and yelling at each other and fighting in front of students. Like, stop stealing my stuff. And the art teacher was furious because everyone sent people to her classroom, interrupting her lessons so they could borrow art supplies. And she was like, bring your own damn scissors. Stop interrupting my class. And so, once the teachers started working out their issues, the behavior of the students started to improve. Not because we did something different with the students, we did something different with the adults. And I've seen that pattern in school after school after school that I've worked with, where if we can change the relationships of the adults, model what relationship looks like, model what respect looks like, model what trust looks like, well, then students can start doing it.
Yeah.
Because they
Joe,
see that it works.
Yeah, you're talking about it with this respect agreement process is, first of all, adults always have to go first if we're trying to change the culture of the school.
Yes.
And secondly, you're talking about what are our relational protocols. Because we've got systems, operational protocols, but what are our relational protocols? How do we teach? How do we treat each other? And what has always surprised me that staff, leadership and staff in schools don't necessarily, they're not necessarily able to join the dots around that. So we're doing this with kids. There's a thought. Why don't we use these same kinds of philosophical approaches to problem solving to create first the environment we want and then to move quickly to keep the small things small so we don't have these sort of toxic teams or the us and them kind of relationships. So we're talking about the dynamics of conflict that are universal. It doesn't matter if we're talking about your school in your state in America or the state high school in Goondiwindi, which is a little western town that I grew up in Queensland. People are people. We're warm-blooded hairy mammals. We have the same issues around trust, all of us, because we have to feel safe to, leave our cognitive processes intact, because we've got no option, really. That's the way it has to happen.
I mean, I think it goes back to what you all said too, is that it's modeling, right? And it's building a foundation that we all operate on, and then kids will respond. But when we're operating as adults in a space that isn't grounded in that relational connection as a adult group, why and how could we expect kids to operate in that space when we're unwilling to do it ourselves. And I think that really is the foundation of a lot of this work. Is it really is about us. It's about the adults and us redoing and redeveloping these systems as models. We need to model that, right? And that goes down to everything. I did not, and I had a teacher who had a respect agreement between her and the students and the students and students and vice versa. And when she didn't meet that agreement, she made a rupture. She would literally repair it right then. And she would say, I'm going to go back to my agreement with you. Her name is Leah Sutphin. She still teaches. And she would say, I didn't meet my agreement with you. I got really frustrated in this. And so I need to acknowledge that. And I apologize that happened. Let me tell you what I'm going to try to do next time. Right. That's it. That's the model. And we have to do that for each other as colleagues as well. As I said, you all, our 45 minutes was going to go really fast, and it has gone by extremely fast. So we're going to have a 2.0 of this. And I'll be quite honest, probably selfishly, because I need to hear this. It's May. We are at the end of the school year. I am planning for next year, and so much of what you've said is resonating to my soul that I know, and I know what to do, but I need to hear it. And I think that speaks to this work. No matter how great we know it, we have to continue to reconnect back to these foundational principles of what this work means when we're in the work ourselves. So I appreciate it. And again, selfishly, I want a 2.0. But as we move forward, what message do you have to educators across the globe right now? What do you want them to know?
Look, in the I think what we're after really is two things: remembering that we are humans who are wired for connection and community, that sense of belonging and safety and so on. But in terms of the systems in the school, the systems should be working so that they're not transactional systems, but transformative systems. So, I would always be asking the people I trained, think about, what they have at their fingertips in schools and how much of that processes that they have in place are actually building and repairing, or are they just tick a box and, sorry, kid, you're on detention, or you're out on your ear because you've sworn at a teacher who's poked the bear, So yes, humans are biologically wired for connection, so we better get better at it.
Absolutely. Joe, what do you have to say?
Well, that's such a big question, isn't it? I guess the one thing I want educators globally to know is that I've been in schools now and all over the place. Like, I've worked with schools in different places. Marg and I are working with some educators in Spain. We're working with educators, and I work with educators in Kansas, and then I come back and I work with people in Connecticut. You're not all having the same problems. We seem to have lumped school together in like this big clump when we're a lot more unique than that. And the educators in Kansas are not facing the same problems that we're facing here in Connecticut. And the educators in New South Wales are not experiencing the same things that are happening in the UK. And like, we have these individual things. And so I guess what I want educators to know is, like, we see you. Like, I see that, like, what you're going through is very unique to you, and the problems you're facing, but yet we're kind of all in the same storm if we're not in the same boats. Like we get this is like out of control stressful for educators, but I think what's happening is the solutions people are throwing to educators are sort of blanket, when I don't see the same problems in Kansas and that I see in Connecticut. And I definitely don't see the problems from Kansas and Connecticut. I don't see what's going in some of the schools that we're hearing from in the UK. Like, Marg and I are going to talk we're doing a talk together in London tomorrow morning, which is well, tomorrow morning for me, it's noontime for them.
Yeah.
But we're going to do a virtual presentation tomorrow for the UK, and I'm sorry, the problems that they're facing aren't what we're facing. And so I guess I want educators to know that, like, we know that what you're going through isn't like a blanket. We know that your problems are like, they're yours. They are a struggle for you, but we see it. Like, we hear you. We want to help you and support you somehow.
That is so valid. And I probably needed to hear that myself, right? Because you can sometimes get it, you're not looking up out of it. And so I think leaving with that, and I want to leave with one thing that Mark said. It's about systems of transformative, but not transactional. Think about that as you go into the world. And remember, just go and honestly just do something absolutely awesome. All right. That was you. I'm not joking. We need a 2.0, and I may just need a private session at this point.
So that still
you.
says live. Did you turn that off?
Oh no, we're still live on social media, so we're still there. So I wanted to thank everybody that was here live. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for coming,
Linda. And I never can say your name right because it's Australian. And how do you say it, Marg? Louise.
Louise.
Louise. Okay, I just want to make sure because I don't know if you know, my last guest was from Australia and I had her name completely wrong. So I want to make sure I say respect. So thank you, Louise Rogers. Thank you, Linda Knight, for being on here live with us. We really do appreciate you listening live. And to anybody else that is listening on any of the streams, please reach out to Joe and Marg if you want to connect and learn more about the book or have them come and speak to your school or organization.
Or you could come to us. You could come to us. We are doing in Kansas in July. We're doing like a summer institute. And the best part of it is that there are some guest writers that wrote in the book for us. Jessica Harris, who writes about a suspension program called CLIMB, which is an acronym that stands for Children Learning to Independently Manage Behavior. And Jessica is going to be part of this week-long summer institute, along with the amazing Meg Baldwin, who brings amazing skills about regulating children, de-escalation spaces, Bella Vizex. And then we also have Dr. Rick Kane coming to talk about wellness for educators, to go beyond self-care and to deeply understand what it means to regulate your own nervous system by making sure you're taking care of yourself. Because when we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not regulated. And so if you're interested in that, we definitely repost a link on all my social media. So all my social media has that, the link for that pinned to the top. And so visit any of my socials and you'll find more information about coming out to that Summer Institute. And then Marg and I will also be in Portland, Oregon in June, the end of June. So with the National Center on Restorative Practices. And so like, come hang out with us. Like,
Marg, are you going to be in Kansas or are you joining virtually?
No, I'm not in Kansas. I think it'll be virtual. There are some, I would like to be able to, hop into the telephone booth and transport myself everywhere, but diaries and other commitments always get in the road.
Yeah,
so
no worries. And that's not an easy flight. Trust me, I've done it a couple times. It's a long way. Well, thank you all. And thank you for those of you who listen. I'll be honest, I don't have my next podcast booked because it is May in a school. And I just haven't even thought about who I'm going to have on next. But June, July, I'm looking forward to having a lot of folks on. And hopefully, Joe, some of the people you just mentioned, especially Jess, she's a mutual friend. And I would love to the listeners to hear from her. So thank you all for listening. Appreciate it. Joe and Marg, if you'll hold on just 1 minute, and I will see you when I see you all next. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.